a lot of the legitimacy came from the ideas behind it, the
Hmm.
political Zionism, and the way that it's. I must give them credit, like to unify that identity and like to keep that identity going and to propagate these ideas throughout the national sphere, like the international sphere. Um, that shows like quite a lot of tenacity from them, and it's impressive
Oh,
that
for
they're
sure.
able to get these ideas out. It does come at the cost of, we were talking about, so the cultural and practical Zionism, I think, has been a little bit more muted over the years. That the ideas of like, well, the legitimacy comes from establishing yourself and working and building relationships. I think it's turned more into more the assertion aspect of like, well, we deserve this land, and or we fought for this land, and or it's like, this is, we should be granted this land because we are owed, because that's more of a heavy-handedness rather than a historical fact of
Yeah.
them being on the land for multiple hundreds of years.
Well, and as well, I feel like a more convincing case rather than this is a country that was granted sovereign rights and etc. I think a more convincing argument would be, uh, they did weather not only weather, but they did actually win two wars from a conglomerate of Arab nations against them, and they came out victorious. So in in any other place in the world, land is won and lost through war. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
I would say in this case, it's because you had established settlements and you still had individuals, and you didn't have like it wasn't as much of a united front in the way of, it's not like you had the nation of Palestine and you didn't have an established war. You had, it was less defined that way. So the war ended up just affecting the property rights of a lot of individuals. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's where it seems a little bit different than like two nations fighting about the imaginary line on a map. This was like an interwoven shared area. And that seems, I think that's where you get more into the language where people will call this ethnic cleansing, of like
Mm-hmm.
one group wanting to change the demographic split of an area that is shared. And
Mm-hmm.
you could find other examples in Africa, or even examples of
In
um,
Eastern Europe.
yeah, this is something that's come up before, but I think when you have intermixed populations, this is a little bit more than two sovereign states trying to establish their borders.
Well, yes, and as is the case with I would say, um, probably pretty uncontroversially, most wars in history, it is the common person, the average person, that suffers the most and has truly the least stake in it. And more often than not, it's the battle of two ideologies, maybe represented by rather actually a small percentage of both populations.
Yeah, you can kind of narrow it down to, you have the elites and you have their ideologies being fought out by just the common people. And the most difficult part is that any idea of justice now is a lost cause, because both groups will define justice as something that's unattainable without massive harm to the other group. And as you get more perceived harm, you get more radicalization on both sides. So you'll get more radicalized. Um, you get Hamas now, which is, seems like it's basically a hindrance to any two state solution is going to be hindered by the more radical elements in Hamas, because in the international community they'll say, well, they can't govern themselves because they're a loose cannon. They can't even, like, look at these radicals. They have no place on the international stage because of their conduct. And then as you get radical elements on one side, you get radical elements on the other. with this more kind of tunnel vision idea of what an Israeli state should be. So you have some more balanced Zionists, some of them more practical, some of them more cultural, and then you have the hardcore political that really have a vision for what that area should look like. And I think the more radical one side gets, the more radical another. And I think this is what perpetuates these atrocities. But we can always dive into it a little bit more in our other episodes.